Savannah in 1847 moved to a rhythm that had been shaped for decades by the buying and selling of human beings, a rhythm so normalized that most white residents barely noticed it anymore. Yet on certain mornings, the air itself seemed heavier, as if the city knew something especially cruel was about to unfold. The port city sat swollen with wealth drawn from cotton, rice, and sugar, all of it dependent on enslaved labor, and the auction yards were as familiar as churches or markets, places where people gathered not with shame but with expectation. Word had traveled quietly through parlors and drawing rooms that this particular sale would be different, that a group of enslaved men recently arrived would be offered, men described in coded language as exceptional, a word that did not mean skilled or educated but physically striking. And by sunrise the streets leading to the yard filled with carriages polished to a shine. The presence of white women was not unheard of at slave sales, but it was uncommon enough to draw glances, especially when they arrived not as passive companions, but as independent participants, stepping down from carriages with confidence, gloved hands resting on parasols, dresses arranged carefully as if attending a social event rather than a transaction rooted in violence. The yard itself was enclosed by wooden fencing, darkened by years of sun and humidity, its boards bearing the marks of chains, boots, and countless hands that had leaned against them while waiting to bid. The platform stood slightly raised, rough planks nailed together, positioned so bodies could be seen clearly from every angle, and nearby a small table held ledgers where names were replaced by numbers and prices, lives condensed into ink marks. Enslaved men were brought out early, before the crowd fully gathered, ordered to stand in line, shoulders back, heads up, their expressions carefully controlled, because they had learned that any sign of resistance could mean punishment before the auction even began. Some had been forced to wash in cold water, their skin scrubbed raw to remove dirt and scars that might lower value, their hair trimmed not for dignity but for display, as though they were livestock prepared for inspection. They knew Savannah, even if they had never been there before, because the stories of its markets traveled along the same whispered networks as stories of whippings and escapes, and standing in that yard they could hear the distant sounds of the city waking, church bells, carts rolling over cobblestones, ordinary life continuing just beyond the fence. As the crowd grew, murmurs spread, eyes moved slowly over the line of men, measuring height, build, symmetry, all without speaking their names, because names made it harder to pretend this was ordinary commerce. When the women gathered closer, forming small groups shaded by parasols, their presence altered the atmosphere in subtle but unmistakable ways, drawing the attention of traders who understood money as well as performance, who adjusted their language, softened their tone, spoke of quality and investment, with a practiced politeness. These women had been raised in a society that taught them refinement and restraint, yet slavery gave them a space where desire, curiosity, and control could exist without consequence, protected by law and custom, and as they looked toward the platform, their expressions revealed anticipation rather than discomfort. The men on display could feel those looks even when they did not meet them directly, could sense the way attention lingered longer than it would have at a typical labor auction, could hear the hush that fell when someone especially tall or well-built was brought forward for closer inspection. For many of the enslaved, this moment carried a specific kind of dread, because being singled out for appearance had always meant vulnerability, not privilege, meant being separated from familiar labor or from family members already sold away, meant becoming subject to whims that had nothing to do with work or survival. The auctioneer, a man whose voice had learned to rise and fall like a preacher's, began to speak as the sun climbed higher, welcoming bidders, praising the selection, reminding them of Savannah's reputation as a place where the finest human property passed through, his words smooth, practiced, empty of any acknowledgement that the men behind him were listening. The women stepped forward slightly, close enough now that the rustle of fabric mixed with the clink of chains, close enough that the contrast between silk and bare skin became impossible to ignore, yet still the scene unfolded with the appearance of civility, because slavery depended not only on violence but on the performance of normalcy. No one announced openly why this auction drew such interest, because it did not need to be said. The rules were understood, the language coded, the intent hidden beneath manners, and the men stood waiting, their futures narrowing. With every passing second as the crowd prepared to bid, unaware of the exact shape their lives would take after this day, but certain that nothing good could come from being judged beautiful in a world that saw them as property. As the auction formally began, the shift from quiet observation to open appraisal happened with unsettling speed, the murmurs sharpening into deliberate commentary as bidders positioned themselves for advantage, and the auctioneer's voice cut through the humid air with practiced authority, calling attention to each man as though unveiling merchandise rather than human lives. One by one, the enslaved men were instructed to step forward, turn, raise their arms, open their mouths, flex hands, perform small movements meant to demonstrate health and strength, all while knowing that every motion would be interpreted, judged, and priced. The crowd leaned in closer now, and the women who had gathered near the front did not avert their eyes, instead studying posture, facial structure, skin tone, and expression with an intensity that unsettled even seasoned traders because it revealed a form of ownership that went beyond fields and workshops. Fans lifted and lowered in small, deliberate gestures. Whispers passed between mothers and daughters, between friends accustomed to sharing opinions on fabric and jewelry, now applying the same language to human bodies, using words like fine, well-formed, and exceptional terms that stripped complexity from the men they described. The auctioneer adapted his rhythm to the audience, emphasizing qualities he knew would draw higher bids, praising symmetry and youth, occasionally allowing a pause to let anticipation build, understanding that silence could be as profitable as speech. With each pause, the men on the platform felt the weight of collective attention press down harder, a sensation that went beyond fear, into something colder, because they understood that the value being assigned to them was not connected to effort or skill, but to appearance alone. In a typical sale, strength promised productivity, but here beauty promised something less defined and far more dangerous, a future shaped by private desires, shielded by public respectability. Bidding began cautiously, small increments offered through subtle gestures, a raised finger, a tilt of a fan, a nod barely visible, and the auctioneer acknowledged each without breaking his flow, calling out amounts that climbed steadily as competition emerged. When two women found themselves bidding against one another, the tension became unmistakable, their polite smiles tightening as prices rose, neither willing to withdraw first, because in this space money was not just purchasing labor, it was asserting power, status, and entitlement. Observers standing at the edges of the yard noticed how different this felt from other auctions, how the usual rough jokes and blunt assessments were replaced by a refined cruelty, one wrapped in lace and perfume, and some men who had spent years trading enslaved people exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something that exposed the system in a way even violence sometimes did not. For the enslaved men, time seemed to stretch unnaturally, each bid prolonging the moment of exposure, each glance another reminder that their bodies were being claimed without consent, their futures auctioned off piece by piece. Some kept their eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the fence, refusing to meet the gaze of bidders, while others stared straight ahead, faces carefully neutral, knowing that anger could lower value and despair could invite punishment. The auctioneer occasionally intervened, repositioning a man so the light fell differently across his face or shoulders, turning him slightly to lay what he called fine lines, as though he were presenting a statue rather than a living person, with thoughts racing behind his eyes. When a bid jumped unexpectedly high, a ripple of reaction passed through the crowd, a soft intake of breath, a murmur of surprise, and the man at the center of attention felt a sinking certainty that his fate had narrowed further, that whatever awaited him would be shaped by this moment alone. The language used remained careful, never explicit, because it did not need to be. Everyone present understood the implications, understood that beauty in bondage carried its own risks, and that the law would protect the buyer from scrutiny. As bids concluded and sales were finalized, the auctioneer's gavel fell with sharp finality, each strike sealing a decision that could not be undone, and names were replaced by prices written quickly into ledgers, ink drying faster than any moral hesitation. The women who had won their bids appeared composed, satisfied, their expressions betraying nothing more than the successful acquisition of property, and they stepped back into the crowd as though concluding a purchase at a market, while the men they had claimed were led away to waiting areas, chains adjusted, instructions barked quietly to handlers. Around them, Savannah continued its daily rhythm, carts rolled by, conversations resumed, and within minutes, the extraordinary nature of the auction began to dissolve into routine, yet for those who stood on that platform, the memory would remain etched permanently, a moment when their humanity was measured, compared, and sold, not for what they could do, but for how they looked, leaving them to face futures defined by the cold arithmetic of desire and power. For the enslaved men, the moment after the gavel fell was often more terrifying than the auction itself, because certainty, however cruel, replaced the fragile possibility of chance, and as chains were tightened and hands guided them away from the platform, each step carried the weight of a future now sealed by someone else's desire. The yard that moments earlier had felt suffocatingly public became strangely distant, its sounds fading into a dull hum as the men were separated according to buyers, pulled into small groups or isolated entirely, their bodies already reorganized to suit new ownership. Some tried to memorize the faces of those around them, fellow captives whose presence had offered silent comfort during the ordeal, knowing that within minutes they might never see one another again, that shared glances would dissolve into memory. Fear moved through them in different ways, settling in the chest, tightening the throat, hollowing the stomach, because being chosen for appearance carried a history whispered among the enslaved. Stories passed quietly from one person to another about men taken into houses rather than fields, about expectations unspoken but enforced, about punishments that left no marks visible to outsiders. No law acknowledged their fear, no record would note the reason for it, yet it shaped every thought as they were led through gates and corridors into holding rooms where the air smelled of sweat, wood, and old iron. Some buyers sent representatives to inspect their purchases once more, issuing instructions as though arranging the transport of goods, while the men stood silent, knowing that any protest could be met with immediate violence. In those moments, thoughts often drifted to family left behind, to mothers whose faces might never be seen again, to brothers and friends whose fates remained unknown, and the ache of separation pressed harder than the chains, because slavery did not only steal the body, it dismantled every connection that made life bearable. For some, memory became a refuge, recalling fragments of songs, the rhythm of work, the sound of laughter shared in secret. Small pieces of humanity clung to fiercely because everything else had been stripped away. The men understood that their silence was expected, that composure could mean survival, and so they learned to bury terror beneath stillness, to control breath and expression as carefully as they had been taught to control posture on the platform. Around them, the machinery of the auction continued efficiently, ledgers closed, payments counted, conversations turned to weather and dinner plans, the extraordinary violence of what had occurred disguised beneath routine. As they were marched toward wagons or escorted through side streets to nearby residences, the contrast between their internal chaos and the calm of the city felt almost unbearable, because Savannah showed no sign of disruption, no acknowledgement that lives had been irrevocably altered within its bounds. People passed by without looking twice, accustomed to the sight of enslaved men in transit, unaware or unwilling to consider what had distinguished this sale from countless others. The men felt exposed even beyond the yard, conscious of how eyes lingered, how whispers followed, how being labeled valuable marked them in ways that could not be undone. Some feared isolation above all else, the prospect of being kept apart, watched constantly, denied even the limited community that plantation labor sometimes allowed, while others feared proximity, the closeness of a household where control could be exerted quietly. invisibly, without witnesses. Nightfall brought little relief, because darkness did not mean rest. It meant anticipation, waiting to learn what rules governed this new life, what expectations would be imposed, what punishments awaited disobedience. In the silence, thoughts turned inward, questions looping endlessly. Do I? Without answers, why beauty had become a curse, how a body could invite such attention and such danger, how a world could assign worth in this way and still call itself civilized. Some clung to the belief that endurance itself was a form of resistance, that surviving with mind intact was an act of defiance, even if no one else would ever recognize it as such. Others felt anger rise, sharp and dangerous, and forced it back down, knowing that visible rage could lead to immediate suffering. The enslaved had long understood the importance of reading power, of anticipating moods and unspoken rules, and now they applied that knowledge with desperate precision, watching for cues, listening for tone, learning quickly how to remain unnoticed when possible and compliant when necessary. Yet beneath this learned control, a quiet grief spread, the realization that what had happened on that platform would never be named honestly, that no record would describe their fear or the violation inherent in being chosen for beauty, that history would reduce the day to a transaction without context. Even so, memory persisted, held within bodies and minds, passed silently when possible. Because the enslaved understood something their oppressors often did not, that remembering was a form of survival. In that remembering, the auction remained vivid, the faces, the sounds, the raised hands, the final crack of the gavel, and though they could not escape the consequences of that day, they carried its truth with them, an unspoken testament to the cost of a system that turned human beings into objects and called the process lawful, leaving scars that would endure long after the yard itself faded into dust. Within the society that allowed such auctions to exist, white women occupied a position carefully shielded by custom, law, and selective memory, a position that history often softened or excused, portraying them as distant observers rather than active participants. Yet moments like this auction exposed a more complicated and unsettling truth. From childhood, these women were taught that refinement defined them, that they represented morality, order, and domestic virtue, and slavery was woven into those lessons so seamlessly that it rarely appeared as cruelty, instead presented as inheritance, tradition, and necessity. They grew up surrounded by enslaved people who cooked their meals, cleaned their homes, dressed their children, and attended to their daily comforts, learning to accept dependence without acknowledging the cost paid by others. By the time they reached adulthood, the presence of enslaved bodies in their lives felt natural, even invisible, and the idea that ownership could extend into every corner of existence, including desire and preference, did not require justification. The auction yard offered a space where that entitlement became public without consequence, where money transformed curiosity into authority, and where gender did not limit power but reshaped it. These women did not need to shout or threaten, because the system itself spoke for them, enforcing their will through contracts, chains, and silence. Their bids were accepted with the same respect granted to men, recorded without comment, protected by laws that defined enslaved people as property and buyers as rightful owners, regardless of motive. Even those who might have felt fleeting discomfort could rely on social conventions to smooth it away, reassured by the shared understanding that whatever occurred within the bounds of slavery was not only permissible but proper. Conversations after the auction reflected this ease, focusing on prices, bargains, and arrangements, never on the humanity of those purchased, because acknowledging that humanity would have required confronting their own role in its denial. In parlors and dining rooms, the story of the auction would be retold selectively, framed as an unusual sale, perhaps even an amusing one, stripped of its violence and reduced to anecdote, while the men whose lives had been claimed disappeared into households or estates where their presence would be tightly controlled. Society reinforced this erasure by refusing to ask questions, by treating silence as politeness and by punishing anyone who disrupted the illusion of gentility that slavery relied upon. The moral contradictions were immense, yet they were managed through habit and distance, through the careful separation of public image and private action. A woman could attend church, teach her children scripture, and bid on a human being in the same week without feeling conflict, because the culture around her provided language that reconciled these acts, insisting that ownership did not negate virtue. Men who enforced slavery through violence were often criticized quietly for excess, but women who participated financially or socially were rarely scrutinized, their actions cloaked in assumptions of innocence and passivity that did not reflect reality. The auction demonstrated how slavery corrupted not only economic relationships, but moral ones, allowing people to compartmentalize cruelty until it felt like routine. For the enslaved, this hypocrisy was impossible to miss, visible in every interaction where politeness masked domination, where soft voices issued commands backed by force. The women who bought enslaved men carried their authority into private spaces where oversight was minimal, where control could be exercised subtly and continuously, and the absence of witnesses made resistance even more dangerous. Yet history's record would rarely capture this dimension, focusing instead on laws, battles, and prominent male figures, leaving the quiete. Our forms of participation largely unexamined. The result was a narrative that minimized female involvement while maximizing comfort for those who preferred to see slavery as a masculine enterprise, distant from the domestic sphere. In truth, the institution depended on the active consent and engagement of women as much as men, on their willingness to accept ownership as normal, to benefit from it, and to enforce it within their domains. The auction yard, briefly, stripped away the protective veil, revealing how deeply ingrained the system was, how effortlessly social norms accommodated acts that, viewed without context, would appear monstrous. Afterward, life resumed with practiced normality, visits were paid, letters written, meals shared, and the men purchased became part of the background of daily existence, their suffering absorbed into routine. This normalization was perhaps the most enduring violence of all, because it ensured that such events could repeat without outrage, that memory itself would be shaped to exclude discomfort. To confront this history honestly requires acknowledging that cruelty did not always announce itself with whips and chains, that it often arrived dressed in respectability, spoken softly, and defended by tradition, and that the auction in Savannah was not an aberration but a revelation of how thoroughly slavery permeated every layer of society, distorting values until ownership felt natural and empathy became optional. When the auction ended and the yard emptied, Savannah returned to its familiar cadence with unsettling ease, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. And this quiet continuation was perhaps the clearest demonstration of how deeply slavery had embedded itself into the city's identity. Wagons rolled back onto the streets, shopkeepers opened their doors wider as the day warmed, and conversations shifted toward ordinary conch. Urns, meals, visitors, and business, while the lives altered within those wooden fences faded instantly from public awareness. The men who had been sold were absorbed into new routines with deliberate efficiency, their presence explained away as property newly acquired, their origins irrelevant, their past erased the moment they crossed into private spaces. Records would note the transactions in neat handwriting, dates, prices, names of buyers, but they would not capture the fear, the humiliation, or the knowledge carried by those men as they stepped into futures shaped by forces they could not influence. Over time, even those ledgers would be forgotten, tucked away in archives, their significance dulled by distance, leaving behind only fragments that hinted at what had occurred. Savannah itself would transform across generations, buildings replaced, streets renamed, yet the foundation laid by slavery would remain embedded in its wealth and institutions, rarely acknowledged in ways that disrupted comfort. The auction would not become legend or scandal because it fit too neatly into the accepted order, because outrage required a moral framework that slavery itself had dismantled. Those who attended would remember selectively, if at all, recounting the day as a curiosity or forgetting it entirely, while the men sold would carry the memory with them in bodies that bore witness even when voices could not. For the enslaved, survival depended on adaptation, on learning new rules quickly, on navigating power structures that shifted without warning, and this adaptability ensured that their suffering remained largely invisible to those who benefited from it. Yet invisibility did not mean absence, and the consequences of that day would ripple outward quietly, shaping relationships, reinforcing hierarchies, and normalizing abuses that thrived in silence, long after emancipation. The legacy of such auctions would linger, not always in explicit memory, but in patterns of inequality, in inherited wealth, in cultural narratives that softened or ignored the brutality of the past. The tendency to frame slavery as an abstract institution rather than a series of lived experiences made it easier to avoid confronting moments like this one, moments that exposed uncomfortable truths about desire, power, and complicity. Remembering the auction now is not about sensationalism, but about restoring context to history, about refusing to allow politeness and distance to obscure the realities endured by those who were denied agency. It challenges simplified narratives that divide participants into clear villains and passive observers, revealing instead a society broadly invested in maintaining control, willing to rationalize almost anything to preserve its advantages. For modern audiences, such remembrance carries responsibility because acknowledging the full scope of this history disrupts myths that continue to influence how the past is understood and taught. It forces recognition that cruelty can coexist with civility, that injustice often operates most effectively when it appears normal, and that systems of oppression rely not only on overt violence but on widespread acceptance. The men sold in Savannah did not leave behind written testimonies, but their experiences persist through careful reconstruction, through attention to what records omit as much as what they include. In giving space to these stories, even imperfectly, the silence that once protected the institution of slavery is challenged, and the humanity denied on that platform is partially reclaimed. The auction, viewed in this light, becomes more than an isolated event. It becomes a mirror reflecting the moral failures of a society that valued profit and control over human life. Confronting this, reflection is uncomfortable, but it is necessary because forgetting allows repetition in new forms, while remembrance offers the possibility of accountability. The quiet yard in Savannah may no longer exist, but the truth of what happened there endures, waiting to be acknowledged honestly, not as a footnote, but as a testament to the resilience of those who endured it and a warning against the ease with which injustice can be woven into everyday life.